The lantern trembles as you descend the stone stairs beneath Topkapi Palace. The air grows colder, thick with seawater and something that tightens your throat. From the shadows comes the sound of needle through fabric, then muffled breathing. Tonight, you'll see what the empire hid. Beauty built on fear, paradise turned to tomb. Before we go further into this darkness, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. It fascinates me how a story buried for centuries in Istanbul's archives can reach someone reading this in Sao Paulo, Mumbai, or Melbourne right now. The year was 1617, and the woman being sewn into that sack had committed no murder. She'd stolen nothing. She hadn't plotted rebellion or attempted escape. Her crime was simpler, more human, and in the eyes of the Ottoman court, absolutely unforgivable. She had fallen in love. For over 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire commanded 3 continents, built architectural marvels that still take our breath away, and developed legal systems that influenced civilizations from Vienna to Cairo. But in the heart of its power, behind walls few outsiders ever penetrated, operated something that defied every principle of the justice the empire claimed to represent. The imperial harem wasn't just a residence for the Sultan's women. It was a laboratory of control, where the Ottomans perfected techniques of psychological domination so sophisticated that modern interrogators study the records with a mixture of professional admiration and moral horror. What makes this story particularly unsettling isn't just the brutality. History overflows with violence. It's the precision. The Ottomans didn't break women through random cruelty or passionate rage. They had systematized suffering, turning it into an administrative function as routine as tax collection, complete with training manuals, performance reviews, and interdepartmental memoranda, discussing the most effective methods of destroying human will while keeping bodies functional. And at the center of this system stood a figure whose very existence seems designed to illustrate the depths of human corruption. The Kislar Asa, the chief black eunuch, a man who could never touch a woman but wielded absolute power over hundreds of them. His footsteps in the harem corridors created instant silence. Women who'd been laughing seconds earlier would freeze mid-sentence, their smiles becoming masks of performance rather than genuine joy. He moved through the palace like winter itself, bringing not cold but the absence of warmth, the erasure of safety, the guarantee that nothing, not friendship, not beauty, not even perfect obedience, could protect you if he decided your time had come. The appointment to this position required specific qualifications that reveal everything about Ottoman priorities. Candidates needed intelligence to navigate the treacherous politics of the palace, where a wrong word could topple empires. They needed literacy to maintain the detailed records that tracked every woman's behavior, conversations, relationships, and subtle shifts in loyalty. But above all, they needed something the Ottoman administrative documents described with chilling casualness: the capacity for necessary action without emotional interference. In other words, the ability to order a woman drowned at noon and enjoy dinner at sunset without a flicker of conscience. What the Kislar Aasu understood, what the entire system was built upon, was that physical walls alone couldn't contain hundreds of women, many of whom had been kidnapped from their homes, torn from their families, and trapped in a life they never chose. The real prison had to be psychological. And so the Ottomans constructed something far more sophisticated than chains or locked doors. They built an environment where trust itself became toxic, where every human connection was a potential weapon, and where the women became complicit in their own oppression. The informant networks were masterpieces of corrupted humanity. A woman who reported another's minor infraction, perhaps an overheard complaint about the food, or a moment of tears when she thought no one was watching, might receive a small privilege: better sleeping quarters, an extra blanket in winter, a piece of fruit that wasn't half-rotted. These tiny rewards created a marketplace of betrayal where mothers informed on daughters, where sisters destroyed sisters, and where the woman sleeping beside you might be cataloging your dreams for tomorrow's report. But here's what the archives reveal that most sanitized histories omit. The Kislar Aası didn't just respond to infractions. He created them. He would plant false rumors to see who would spread them, stage fake escape opportunities to identify potential resistors, even arrange for prohibited items, letters, jewelry, anything that represented connection to the outside world, to mysteriously appear in women's chambers, then conduct searches to discover them. The punishment system operated on graduated tiers, each calibrated to send specific messages to the broader harem population. The first tier, what palace documents euphemistically termed behavioral refinement, targeted women who failed to perform happiness convincingly enough. This wasn't about being sad. Sadness was expected and easily managed. This was about insufficient enthusiasm, about smiles that didn't reach the eyes, about the micro-expressions of resignation or despair that suggested a woman still remembered she was human rather than property. The standing punishment forced women to remain bound and upright in public courtyards for days, watched by others. Pain turned to lasting injury. Collapsed veins, crushed spines, ruined nerves. Those who broke were sent to the isolation chambers below, soundless, lightless cells designed to unmake the mind. Inside, time dissolved. Voices vanished. Women entered with memories and names, but emerged as properly adjusted, their identities fractured, their humanity systematically erased in the name of obedience. But the Ottomans weren't satisfied with breaking spirits. They wanted to understand exactly how spirits broke, which meant they observed, recorded, and refined their techniques with scientific rigor that would have impressed contemporary European anatomists. The palace archives contain detailed case studies tracking individual women through punishment protocols, noting which methods produced compliance versus which created martyrs, which approaches were most cost-effective, and which left subjects functional enough to continue serving imperial needs. The third tier addressed more serious infractions: attempts to communicate with the outside world, formation of romantic or intimate bonds within the harem, or any behavior suggesting the woman still considered herself capable of autonomous choice. Here, the Ottomans deployed their most psychologically sophisticated weapon, forcing women to witness the punishment of anyone they cared about. The genius of this approach lay in its efficiency. One torture session could break multiple women simultaneously, the victim suffering physical pain while her friends experienced something worse. The knowledge that their affection had caused this suffering, that caring about anyone was itself a weapon that would be used against both of you. Over time, this created an environment where emotional isolation became a survival strategy, where women learned to feel nothing because feeling anything was too dangerous. Fatma, a Circassian girl who'd entered the palace at 15, made the mistake of forming a genuine friendship with another concubine. They would whisper late at night about their families, their homes, keeping memories alive in the only way they could. When the Kislar Aası discovered this connection, and, of course, he discovered it, because someone always reported these things, he didn't separate them. He did something more instructive. He had Fatma's friend beaten in front of her, methodically and without anger, while explaining in careful detail that every blow was Fatma's fault, that her selfish need for companionship was causing this pain, that if she truly cared about her friend she would never have endangered her with emotional attachment. The beating lasted until Fatma begged for mercy. Only then did the Kislar Aası reveal the lesson. Your friend's pain ends when you feel nothing. Watch without emotion. Some women failed and suffered for days. Others mastered indifference until it became real. The fourth tier punished those who thought themselves special, made to watch the Sultan with other women, their own encounters recited like livestock records. Each word stripped away illusion until they understood. They were property, interchangeable, forgotten. The psychological devastation of learning that your deepest emotional experiences had been nothing more than routine administrative procedures, that the whispered words you'd treasured were literally scripted, that committees of eunuchs had discussed your body's responses in the same tone they'd use to evaluate a new horse. This broke something in women that physical torture couldn't touch. Some went catatonic. Others became eerily cheerful, their minds having constructed elaborate delusions to avoid confronting reality. The most tragic simply went silent, their eyes still tracking movement but showing no sign that anything human remained behind them. But there was a fifth tier, reserved for women who'd exhausted all other forms of correction. Women who continued showing sparks of resistance or independent thought despite everything the system had thrown at them. For these women, the Ottomans had developed what they considered their most sophisticated procedure, the drowning ceremony. The process began not with the victim, but with the audience. Every woman in the harem would be assembled to witness what followed, not the drowning itself, but the preparation, which was the point. The condemned woman would be stripped of everything that connected her to individual identity. Clothing that might indicate her region of origin, jewelry that might have been a gift from family, even the henna patterns on her hands that marked her ethnicity. She was being reduced from person to flesh, from name to number, from someone to nothing. The actual sewing into the weighted sack was performed by specialized palace seamstresses who'd been trained for this specific duty. They used thick needles and coarse rope, working slowly enough that other women could contemplate every stitch, every cry, every moment of the victim's terror. The sack would then be carried through the harem complex on a deliberate route that ensured maximum visibility. Other women would hear the muffled sounds from inside, would know that was a human being in there, someone who'd laughed and cried and dreamed, now reduced to a struggling form in burlap and rope. The Ottoman archives contain disposal records with the same bureaucratic precision they brought to every other administrative function. Dates, locations along the Bosphorus where different categories of offenders were drowned, even weather conditions. Apparently, calm seas were preferred because the splash and subsequent sinking were more visible from palace windows. Some drowning sites were specifically chosen to be visible from harem quarters, ensuring residents could watch the final moments and understand that this wasn't abstraction but reality, that the woman disappearing beneath those dark waters had been real, was now gone, and would never be mentioned again. After drowning came erasure, names deleted, belongings reassigned, memories forbidden. In a world where identity existed only on palace records, being erased was a second death. Yet the empire's silence failed. Women remembered through code, the one who loved pomegranates, the singer off-key. They etched secret marks and hid scraps of cloth in the walls, silent testaments that defied oblivion, whispering across centuries, "I was here. I existed. Remember me." The psychology of survival in this environment produced behaviors that seem inexplicable until you understand the complete picture. Women would volunteer for the most dangerous assignments, attending the Sultan, which could bring favor but also increased scrutiny and jealousy, not from ambition but from a calculation that it was better to risk spectacular punishment than endure the slow psychological erosion of invisibility. Others would deliberately commit minor infractions, accepting the first tier of punishment because it at least represented acknowledgement, a perverse form of existence confirmation, in a place designed to make you question your own reality. The records show that some women developed what palace physicians couldn't explain, an apparent immunity to the psychological techniques that broke others. Modern trauma specialists who've studied these cases recognize something the Ottomans didn't. Dissociative disorders, where the mind fragments itself as a protective mechanism, creating internal hideaways that external torture can't reach. These women appeared compliant, performed all required duties, but had essentially evacuated their consciousness to some interior space that remained untouched. They survived by dying internally while keeping their bodies functional, a form of resistance the empire could observe but never quite eliminate. The Kislar Ağası served until death or until buying retirement. Some spent decades presiding over atrocities while keeping bureaucratic, horrifying journals archived and untranslated. One, 1606-1620, left a training manual advising punishments by personality and ethnicity, bragging he cut isolation compliance from 6 to 3 weeks and treating informant networks like gardens. He warned against too much force, creating martyrs, or too little, encouraging resistance, advocating perpetual uncertainty, making punishment seem inevitable but unpredictable, since anticipated suffering often broke spirits more effectively than pain itself. But perhaps most chilling was his final paragraph, a reflection on his years of service. The greatest satisfaction of this position is bringing order to chaos, transforming wild and willful girls into properly functioning components of the imperial household. When I entered this office, I questioned whether such transformation was truly possible. I now know with certainty that every woman, regardless of her initial spirit or resistance, can be made to understand her place. This knowledge brings me great peace. The Ottoman Empire finally collapsed in the early 20th century, swept away by nationalism, military defeat, and modernity's relentless advance. The harem system was abolished, the palace opened to tourists, and the machinery of systematic cruelty was dismantled. But the evidence remains, in archives, in archaeological findings, in the physical structure of Topkapi Palace itself, where you can still visit the isolation chambers if you know where to look and have the stomach for it. Today, tourists walk through the harem complex marveling at its beauty, the intricate tile work, the elegant fountains, the stunning views of the Bosphorus. Tour guides discuss the architectural features, the daily routines, the imperial ceremonies. They mention the Kislar Ağası as an administrative functionary, use careful euphemisms about discipline and strict rules, and generally sanitize what occurred into something palatable for visitors taking selfies in courtyards where women once stood for days until their legs gave out. The Turkish government has made some rooms off-limits to tourists, officially for preservation reasons, but perhaps because some spaces carry too much residual horror to be packaged as heritage tourism. The isolation chambers remain largely unexamined. The drowning sites along the Bosphorus are unmarked. The bureaucratic records of who was executed and why sit in archives that most historians find too disturbing to study in detail. In 2012, during restoration work on a lower level of the palace, workers discovered something unexpected. Behind a wall that had been sealed for over a century, they found a small chamber containing dozens of pieces of fabric, each carefully hidden in cracks and crevices. Laboratory analysis dated them to the 16th through 18th centuries. Each piece had been deliberately torn from larger garments and concealed with evident care. The workers, not understanding what they'd found, almost discarded them as old rags before a historian recognized their significance. These were memory markers, each one left by a woman who knew she was about to be erased, leaving behind the only proof of existence she could manage. A scrap of cloth that said, wordlessly, desperately, "I was real. I was here. Don't let them make me disappear." The discovery made minor headlines in archaeological journals but never reached mainstream consciousness. The fabric pieces were catalogued, photographed, and stored in climate-controlled archives where they remain today, representing women whose names we'll never know, whose stories died with them, but who managed one final act of defiance against a system designed to make them vanish without trace. Stand at the Bosphorus by Topkapi, and you face an unmarked grave. Beneath those waters lie countless women, drowned for loving wrongly, speaking freely, or failing to please. The Ottoman Empire's grandeur, its laws, art, and architecture, was built not just on marble but on controlled cruelty. These women weren't exceptions. They were the foundation. Their suffering wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system itself, perfected through power, precision, and the quiet efficiency of forgetting. And the greatest horror isn't that this happened centuries ago in a distant empire. It's that the techniques they perfected, the psychological manipulation, the weaponization of human connection, the systematic destruction of identity, the transformation of victims into accomplices, remain in use today, refined and repackaged but fundamentally unchanged. The Ottoman Kislar Asa would recognize the methodologies of modern totalitarian regimes, human trafficking networks, and coercive control systems, because the underlying principle never changes. If you want absolute power over another human being, you don't just lock the doors. You make them forget there were ever doors at all. Beneath the Bosphorus, in the darkness where no one looks anymore, tiny fragments of cloth might still cling to weighted sacks, holding messages that will never be read from women who refuse to be completely forgotten. They lost their names, their lives, their very existence in official memory. But they won that final battle. We're still talking about them, still trying to understand them, still bearing witness to their systematic destruction. The empire wanted them to vanish without trace. Instead, they became the trace the empire itself couldn't erase, the evidence that no amount of power, no sophistication of cruelty, can completely destroy the human impulse to be remembered, to matter, to insist, even from beyond death. I was here. I was real. And what they did to me should never be forgotten.